Her fingers fumbled with the worn edges of her delivery bag, but her eyes never left the glowing screen of her phone. The message was meant for a killer, but it had landed in the hands of a girl who usually only delivered cold noodles. Target in position. Take the shot. Evelyn Hart looked up, her breath hitching in the freezing Seoul air. Just 10 feet away, a man stood under the neon lights, untouchable and calm. The world knew him as Park Min-yi, the most ruthless mafia boss in the country, a man who lived behind bulletproof glass and shadow. But he didn't see the red dot dancing toward his heart. The street went cold. The engine of her scooter idled, the only sound in the sudden, heavy silence of the district. She was a nobody, a ghost in a navy blue cap. But she was the only one who knew that in the next 5 seconds, the most powerful man in the city would be a corpse. What she did next would change the underworld forever. Stay with me until the end, because the way this delivery girl handled a mafia empire will leave you breathless. Before we dive into the neon-lit streets of Seoul, make sure to like this video, hit subscribe, and comment below. What would you do if you intercepted a hitman's text? Now let's get into it. To the rest of Seoul, Park Min-yi was not merely a man. He was an inevitability. On this rain-slicked Tuesday night in District 7, he stepped out of the rear of a matte black sedan, the heavy door closing with a sound that resembled a muffled gunshot. He stood still for a moment, adjusting the silk cuff of his tailored charcoal suit, his presence instantly draining the oxygen from the sidewalk. Behind him, 4 men in identical black attire fanned out in a practiced, lethal perimeter. They were his shadows, his hounds, but Min-yi moved as if he were entirely alone in a private gallery. He was 34 years old and possessed the kind of stillness that only comes from knowing that every variable in your life is under your absolute control. To those who watch from a distance, he was the personification of modern power, disciplined, immaculate, and utterly untouchable. His life was a masterpiece of cold precision. Every morning, Min-yi woke at 4 a.m. in a penthouse that overlooked the Han River, a glass fortress where even the air seemed filtered of human imperfection. He lived by a code of silence and iron. His empire, built on the bones of the old street gangs but refined into a multi-billion-dollar conglomerate, was a machine that never ground its gears. He dealt in information, loyalty, and the kind of quiet violence that changed national policies without a single word being printed in the press. He was the man who decided which buildings rose in the skyline and which families disappeared into the cracks of the city. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. A single nod from Min-yi could move mountains or bury them. Tonight was supposed to be the crowning achievement of his domestic stability. He was meeting his fiancée, Choi Hana, at an exclusive rooftop lounge that required a biometric scan just to enter the elevator. Hana was the daughter of a shipping magnate, a woman whose grace matched his own clinical detachment. Together, they were the ultimate power couple, a union designed to bridge the gap between old money and the new underworld. Min-yi believed in this union not because of passion. Passion was a liability, but because it was the final piece of his perfect life. He had reached the summit. He had no rivals left who dared to strike, no enemies who hadn't been bought or broken. He was the king of a silent kingdom, and tonight he felt the rare, cold satisfaction of a man who has finally outrun his own mortality. As he walked toward the entrance of the lounge, the neon signs of the district reflected off his polished shoes. He moved with a rhythmic, steady gait, his square shoulders cutting through the mist. He looked like a god of industry, his face partially obscured by the collar of his coat, his jawline sharp enough to draw blood. He was surrounded by wealth, protected by the best security money could buy, and anchored by a woman who represented the pinnacle of Seoul's high society. Everything was in its right place. The world was functioning exactly as he had commanded it to. He felt the weight of the Korean flag pin on his lapel, a small symbol of the authority he held over this concrete jungle. There was no room for error in his world. There was no space for the unexpected. But less than 10 feet away, hidden by the steam rising from a nearby sewer grate and the glare of a cheap smartphone. The unexpected was breathing. Evelyn Hart sat on her battered scooter, the engine rattling in a way that would have offended Min Yi's sense of order. She was soaking wet, her navy blue delivery cap pulled low over her eyes, her hands trembling as they gripped the handlebars. She was the invisible friction in his perfect machine. To Min Yi, she was just a blur in his peripheral vision, a common laborer who belonged to the background noise of the city. He didn't look at her. He didn't think about her. He was too busy being the man who had everything. He was too focused on the perfection of the life he had built to notice that the foundation was already beginning to crumble. Inside his pocket, Min Yi's own phone remained silent. He didn't know that the encrypted servers he trusted had been breached by a localized glitch. He didn't know that the woman he was about to toast with vintage champagne had already signed his death warrant. He was walking into a trap disguised as a celebration, his immaculate suit destined to be a shroud. His perfect life was an illusion, a beautiful lie that was about to be shattered by a girl who delivered noodles for $10 an hour. As he reached the glass doors, the light from a nearby billboard caught the silver of his tie. He looked magnificent. He looked immortal. He looked like a man who had forgotten that the higher you climb, the easier it is for a single bullet to find you. The rain began to fall harder, turning the neon lights into smeared streaks of red and blue. Min Yi paused for a fraction of a second, a strange, instinctual chill blooming at the base of his neck. It was a sensation he hadn't felt in a decade, the feeling of being hunted. He brushed it off as a trick of the wind, a momentary lapse in his ironclad composure. He straightened his back, his posture radiating a cold, terrifying authority that made passers-by look away in fear. He was Park Min Yi, and he was in control. He took one more step toward the door, unaware that a red laser was currently searching for the hollow of his throat. He was a man at the height of his power, seconds away from realizing that in the underworld, perfection is just another word for a target. Evelyn watched him, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She saw the elegance, the cruelty, and the sheer, overwhelming weight of his presence. She saw the man who thought he was a king. And then she looked back down at her screen, where the GPS pin pulse echoed the countdown of his life. The contrast was staggering. The man who had everything was about to lose it all to a betrayal he couldn't see coming. The silence of the street felt like a physical weight, pressing down on her as she realized the choice before her. She was a ghost in his world, a nobody in a worn jacket, but for the next few seconds, she held the life of the most powerful man in Seoul in her shaking hands. The perfect life of Park Min Yi was over. The struggle to survive was about to begin. The cold rain felt like needles against Evelyn's skin, but the chill inside her chest was far worse. She stared at the screen of her cracked smartphone, the GPS pin pulsing with a rhythmic, sickening glow. It was a live tracker, and it was centered directly on the broad, charcoal-clad shoulders of the man standing just a few yards away. Park Min Yi was reaching for the handle of the glass door, his movements fluid and full of a grace that belonged to someone who had never known a day of true desperation. In that moment, Evelyn saw the world divided into two distinct realities. There was his reality, one of silk, steel, and absolute certainty, and there was hers, a world of exhaust fumes, wet pavement, and the crushing weight of being a witness to a murder. The text message sat there like a curse. Target in position. Take the shot. She looked up, her vision blurring for a second as the neon lights of District 7 bled into the dark sky. Her gaze drifted toward the skeletal structure of a construction crane 3 blocks over, then higher, to the darkened windows of the industrial lofts overlooking the square. Somewhere in that blackness, a finger was tightening on a cold metal trigger. Somewhere, a professional was adjusting a scope, centering a crosshair on the man who thought he was a god. Evelyn's breath hitched. Coming out in a ragged, visible puff of white vapor. She was a delivery girl. Her job was to navigate traffic, to beat the clock, and to remain as invisible as possible so that the wealthy could eat their dinners without having to look at the person who brought them. She had no stake in the blood feuds of the Korean underworld. If she turned her scooter around now and sped into the maze of baccalas she knew so well, she could be home in 20 minutes. She could delete the message, throw the phone in the river, and pretend she had never seen the shadow of death descending on Park Min-yi. But then she looked at him again. Min-yi had paused, his hand hovering over the door, his head tilting slightly as if he had heard a faint, discordant note in the city's symphony. For all his power and his cruelty, he was a human being, and he was being led to the slaughter by the person he trusted most. The image of the smiling fiancé on the encrypted profile flashed in Evelyn's mind, a beautiful, predatory mask. The injustice of it sparked a sudden, hot flame of rage in the pit of Evelyn's stomach. All her life, she had been the one who was pushed aside, the one who worked the double shifts while the world ignored her. She knew what it felt like to be a target of someone else's greed. If she did nothing, she wasn't just staying safe. She was becoming an accomplice to the very silence that had kept her small. 10 seconds. That was the mathematical reality her brain calculated with the precision of a veteran rider. In 10 seconds, the assassin would account for the wind and the light. In 10 seconds, the trajectory would be locked. Evelyn felt the vibration of her scooter's engine beneath her, a low, mechanical hum that felt like a heartbeat. Her hands, which had been shaking moments ago, suddenly went still. The fear didn't vanish, but it transformed into a sharp, narrow focus. She wasn't a soldier, and she wasn't a hero, but she was the fastest rider in the district. She knew how to bridge the gap between 2 points better than anyone in this city. She didn't think about the consequences, the police, the mafia, the inevitable hunt that would follow. She only thought about the red dot that was currently settling on the back of Min-yi's neck. Her foot kicked the kickstand up with a sharp metallic snap. Her gloved hand twisted the throttle and the engine roared in protest, the sound echoing off the wet brick walls of the alleyway. She didn't scream. She didn't call out. A voice would be lost in the wind and the rain, and Min-yi's bodyguards would likely shoot her before she could finish a sentence. No, she had to be the disruption. She had to break the line of sight. She plunged into the street, her tires skidding for a terrifying heartbeat on the slick asphalt before finding grip. The world became a smear of gray and neon as she accelerated. She wasn't riding toward a man. She was riding toward a collision with destiny. Every meter she covered felt like a year of her life being stripped away, leaving only the raw, electric pulse of the present. The bodyguards reacted instantly. They saw the blur of navy blue and the flash of a delivery bike heading straight for their boss. They reached into their jackets, their faces contorting into masks of professional violence. Min-yi began to turn, his eyes widening with a flash of genuine surprise, a crack appearing in his mask of perfection. He saw a girl on a battered scooter, her face set in a grimace of pure, unadulterated resolve, coming at him like a guided missile. She wasn't stopping. She wasn't swerving. She was aiming for the space between him and the glass door, a trajectory that would place her body directly between the sniper's perch and the mafia boss's heart. In the final 3 seconds, time seemed to dilate, stretching each millisecond into an eternity. Evelyn could see the individual droplets of rain hanging in the air like diamonds. She could see the silver pin on Min-yi's lapel. She could see the exact moment his guards realized she wasn't holding a weapon, but was instead a shield. The weight of her decision pressed down on her, the realization that there was no going back. She had just declared war on the shadows to save a man who didn't even know her name. As the front tire of her scooter left the pavement, hopping the curb with a jarring thud, Evelyn Hart closed her eyes for a fraction of a second and exhaled. She was no longer a ghost. She was the storm. The impact was coming, and with it, the end of the world as she knew it. The scream of the scooter's engine reached a fever pitch, a mechanical howl that tore through the heavy silence of the rain. Evelyn didn't flinch as the curb rushed up to meet her tires. She leaned into the turn, her body weight shifting with a desperate, practiced grace, forcing the heavy metal frame of the bike to lean further than it was ever designed to go. To Park Min-yi, time had fractured. He saw the blur of navy blue fabric and the glint of a plastic visor, a chaotic intruder invading his carefully curated sanctuary of power. His bodyguards were already drawing their weapons, their eyes tracking the incoming threat with lethal intent, but they were a fraction of a second too slow to comprehend the girl's true objective. Evelyn wasn't aiming for the men. She was aiming for the space they occupied. With a final, violent twist of the handlebars, she sent the scooter skidding across the wet pavement, the metal stand sparking against the stone like a dying star. The bike slammed into Minyi's side with the force of a tidal wave. The impact was brutal and unceremonious, a collision of soft flesh and hard steel that sent the most powerful man and soul sprawling across the slick sidewalk. Evelyn felt the jarring shock vibrate through her collarbone, a sharp, white-hot burst of pain blooming in her shoulder as she went down with him. They tumbled together in a tangle of limbs and wet wool, the momentum carrying them toward the shadow of his armored sedan. Just as Minyi's head hit the pavement and his breath left his lungs in a ragged gasp, the world exploded. A high-velocity crack echoed through the district, a sound sharper and more terrifying than any thunderclap. Above them, the rear window of the black sedan disintegrated into 1,000 shimmering diamonds of tempered glass. The bullet, intended for the center of Minyi's skull, hummed through the space where his head had been less than half a second before. The silence that followed the shot was more deafening than the blast itself. For a heartbeat, the only sound was the hiss of the rain and the cooling metal of the wrecked scooter. Minyi lay pinned beneath the weight of the girl, his face pressed against the cold, wet concrete he had walked upon with such arrogance moments ago. His heart, usually a steady, frozen rhythm, was thundering against his ribs. He could smell the scent of cheap detergent and rainy asphalt clinging to the stranger who had just tackled him. He looked up, his eyes meeting Evelyn through the shattered plastic of her visor. Her face was pale, her lips parted in a silent, terrified pant, but her grip on his expensive suit jacket was like iron. She wasn't letting go. She was shielding him, her small frame arched over his vital organs as if she could personally stop the next round. "Down," she finally choked out, the words sounding more like a sob than a command. "Stay down. There are more." Another shot rang out, biting into the brickwork of the lounge entrance and showering them in red dust. The bodyguards had finally recovered from their shock, forming a human wall around their fallen leader and returning fire into the darkness of the industrial lofts. The street erupted into a chaotic symphony of shouting and gunfire, the clinical perfection of Minyi's life dissolving into the raw, gutter-level reality of a street war. He felt a surge of cold fury, but beneath it, a deeper, more unsettling realization was taking root. He had been betrayed. The sniper had known exactly where he would be standing, exactly when he would pause. And the only reason he was still drawing breath was because of this girl, this invisible nobody who was currently trembling with a fear that made her entire body vibrate against his. Evelyn's mind was a whirlwind of sensory overload. The smell of gunpowder, the stinging rain in her eyes, and the crushing weight of the man beneath her all threatened to pull her into a panic. But she could still see the screen of her phone, which had skidded a few feet away, its screen cracked but still glowing with that lethal GPS pin. The assassins weren't retreating. The plan had changed, just as the text had warned, and the hunters were closing in. She saw the red laser dot reappear, dancing frantically across the pavement, searching for a gap in the bodyguard's defense. It was a predatory eye, cold and hungry. She knew they couldn't stay here. The sedan was a target, the lounge was a trap, and the open street was a graveyard. She looked at Minyi, seeing the confusion and the burgeoning lethal intent in his dark eyes. He didn't know who she was. He likely thought she was part of the play. "They're coming for you," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the rising sirens in the distance. "Your fiancé," she told them everything. The words seemed to hit Minyi harder than the pavement had. For a split second, his mask of command slipped, revealing a man who had just seen his entire world go up in flames. He looked at the shattered glass of his car, then back at the girl. He saw the navy blue cap, the worn jacket, and the raw, honest terror in her gaze. There was no guile in her, no hidden weapon, only the desperate desire to survive the next minute. In that moment, the king of the underworld made a choice that defied every instinct he possessed. He reached out, his large, manicured hand closing around Evelyn's wrist with a grip that was both a threat and a promise of protection. The first bullet had shattered the glass of his car, but it had also shattered the illusion of his untouchable life. He was no longer the man in the suit. He was a target in the rain, and his only ally was a delivery girl with a broken scooter. The bodyguards were shouting for him to get into the car, but Minyi saw the shadow of another sniper repositioning on a nearby roof. The car was a coffin. He looked at Evelyn, his jaw tightening as he made a split-second calculation. He didn't trust her, but he trusted the fear he saw in her eyes. He pulled her closer, shielding her as the next volley of lead tore through the air, the sound of the world ending all around them. The crash had stripped them both of their roles, the boss and the rider, leaving only two souls caught in the crosshairs of a betrayal that had only just begun. The tires of the backup SUV shrieked against the wet pavement as the vehicle surged away from the curb, leaving the shattered glass and the echoes of gunfire behind. Inside the darkened cabin, the air was thick with the smell of ozone and the heavy, metallic scent of blood. Park Min-yi sat in the rear, his frame filling the space with a suffocating, predatory intensity. He did not look like a man who had just escaped death. He looked like a god who was deciding which part of the world to burn first. Beside him, Evelyn Hart was pressed against the leather door panel, her breath coming in shallow, jagged gasps. Her navy blue jacket was torn at the shoulder, stained with the grime of the street, and her hands were still shaking so violently that she had to tuck them under her thighs to keep from crying out. The interior of the car was a vacuum of silence, broken only by the muffled roar of the engine and the frantic thudding of her own heart. Min-yi did not speak for a long time. He simply stared at her, his dark eyes reflecting the passing neon lights of the city like a predatory cat watching a cornered bird. Then, with a slow, deliberate movement that felt more terrifying than the sniper's bullet, he reached out and grabbed her chin. His grip was not gentle. His fingers were like steel talons, forcing her to look directly into a face that was now a mask of absolute, frozen rage. The shadow of the car's interior hid his emotions, but the coldness radiating from him was physical. He leaned in until his lips were inches from her ear, his voice a low, vibrating growl that made the hair on her arm stand up. "Who sent you?" he whispered, the words sounding less like a question and more like a death sentence. "Was it the serpents? Or did my rivals think a girl in a delivery cap was the perfect way to get close enough to finish the job?" Evelyn tried to speak, but her throat felt as though it were filled with dry sand. She shook her head, a stray tear finally breaking free and tracing a path through the soot on her cheek. "Nobody sent me," she managed to wheeze out, her voice cracking under the pressure of his gaze. I just saw the message. It was a mistake. A glitch." Min-yi's eyes narrowed, his thumb pressing harder into her jawline. He did not believe in mistakes. In his world, everything was a calculated move, a piece of a larger, more lethal game. To him, the idea of an innocent bystander risking their life for a stranger was not only improbable, it was an impossibility. He saw the world through the lens of leverage and debt, and he could not find the angle in a delivery girl who looked like she was about to faint from terror. "A glitch," he repeated, the words dripping with a deadly irony. He let go of her chin, only to reach down and snatch her cracked smartphone from the seat between them. He held it as if it were a piece of filth, his eyes scanning the broken screen where the encrypted text still burned in the darkness. As he read the words, the confirmation of his fiancée's betrayal, the cold coordination of his own murder, the muscles in his jaw cordoned like thick rope. The silence in the car deepened, becoming so heavy it felt as though the windows might shatter from the pressure. He wasn't just interrogating her anymore. He was processing the collapse of his entire empire. The woman he was supposed to marry had traded his life for a seat at a different table, and the only proof he had was sitting in the palm of a girl who smelled of cheap rain and exhaust fumes. "How did you get this?" he demanded, his voice rising just enough to signal the end of his patience. He turned the phone toward her, the light from the screen illuminating the raw, bleeding scratch on her forehead. "This is a military-grade encryption. You don't just receive this while delivering noodles." Evelyn swallowed hard, her mind racing back to the modified, second-hand router she had installed in her scooter to poach free Wi-Fi signals across the district. She tried to explain the technical fluke, the way her phone had accidentally acted as a node for the burst transmission, but the more she spoke, the more ridiculous it sounded in the face of his lethal skepticism. She saw the way his hand drifted toward the inside of his jacket, where the dark handle of a pistol was visible. He was done with stories. He wanted a name, a confession, or a reason to get rid of the only witness to his moment of vulnerability. "I don't know who they are," she cried out, her voice rising in a desperate plea that finally seemed to pierce his cold exterior. "I saw the red dot on your chest. I saw the message say take the shot, and I looked up and you were right there. I didn't think. I just didn't want you to die." She began to sob then, the adrenaline finally giving way to a bone-deep exhaustion. She slumped against the door, her small frame looking incredibly fragile against the armored luxury of the car. Minyi watched her, his hand pausing on the grip of his weapon. He looked at her worn-out sneakers, the cheap plastic watch on her wrist, and the way she shielded her face with her hands. She wasn't a professional. She didn't have the calluses of a shooter or the cold eyes of an informant. She was exactly what she appeared to be, a ghost of the city who had briefly stepped into the light. He slowly pulled his hand away from his gun, though his expression remained as hard as granite. He looked back at the phone, then out the window at the blurred streets of Seoul. The city he thought he owned was now a maze of enemies, and his inner circle was a nest of vipers. He had spent his life building a fortress of silk and steel, only to find that the only person in the entire world who had acted to save him was a girl he would have ignored 10 minutes ago. It was a bitter, jagged pill to swallow. He reached out again, but this time his hand didn't go for her throat. He picked up his own secure burner phone and barked a single command to the driver. "Change the destination. We aren't going to the safe house. We're going to the docks." Evelyn looked up, her eyes wide with a new kind of fear. "What are you going to do to me?" she whispered, her voice trembling. Minyi didn't look at her as he pocketed her cracked phone, his profile as sharp and unforgiving as a blade. The lethal interrogation was over, but the danger had only evolved. He was no longer just a boss. He was a man in debt to a nobody, and in his world debts were paid in blood or total loyalty. "You saw the plan, delivery girl," he said, his voice cold and final. "Which means you're part of it now. Whether you like it or not, you're the only person I can trust to see the end of this night. And if you're lying to me, the snipers will be the least of your worries." The black SUV pulled into a cavernous, abandoned shipyard warehouse, the engine's low growl echoing against the rusted corrugated steel walls before cutting out into a heavy, oppressive silence. Park Min-yi stepped out into the damp air, his movements still radiating the lethal grace of a predator, though his immaculate suit was now ruined by the grit of the street. He didn't offer a hand to Evelyn. He simply waited for her to scramble out of the vehicle, her legs nearly giving way as her worn sneakers hit the oil-stained concrete. The warehouse was lit by a few flickering overhead bulbs that hummed with a low-frequency buzz, casting long, distorted shadows across the floor. Two of Min-yi's most loyal guards stood at the perimeter, their faces unreadable, their hands never straying far from the holsters at their hips. Min-yi gestured toward a scarred wooden table bolted to the center of the floor, the kind of place where business was conducted in whispers and settled in lead. "The phone," Min-yi commanded, his voice flat and cold. He didn't need to shout. The authority in his tone was a physical weight. Evelyn reached into her jacket pocket, her fingers brushing against the cold metal of her cracked device. She placed it on the table with a trembling hand, the spiderweb fractures on the screen catching the dim light. Min-yi stood over it, looking down at the device as if it were a venomous snake. He didn't touch it yet. He wanted the truth to come from her lips first, a final test of the loyalty he couldn't quite bring himself to believe in. "Explain it again. Every detail. If a single word deviates from what you told me in the car, you won't leave this shipyard." Evelyn swallowed, her throat feeling like it was lined with glass. She took a ragged breath, the smell of salt and industrial grease filling her lungs, and began to speak. She explained the glitch with the technical clarity of someone who had spent years fixing her own equipment because she couldn't afford a repair shop. She told him about the illicit signal booster she'd rigged to her scooter to bypass the district's paywalls, a patchwork of wires and salvaged code that had accidentally turned her phone into a rogue node for the syndicate's encrypted burst. Minyi listened, his expression as unyielding as a stone monument, but his eyes were sharp, dissecting her words for the slightest hint of a lie. When she reached the part about the message itself, she reached out and tapped the screen, swiping through the cached data that her phone had automatically saved. "It wasn't just the one text," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the hum of the lights. "There were others. They were using a localized frequency. One that only someone standing within a block of the transmitter could intercept." She pulled up a hidden folder, one she hadn't dared show him in the car while his hand was on his gun. It was a series of image files, low resolution but unmistakable. They were photos of Minyi's private schedule, his security rotations, and the structural weaknesses of his penthouse. But the final piece of evidence was the one that truly shattered the room's atmosphere. It was an audio clip, only 5 seconds long, recorded via a remote trigger. Evelyn pressed play. The voice that emerged from the tiny, tinny speaker was melodic and refined, the voice of a woman who moved through the highest circles of Seoul's elite. "He will be at the District 7 entrance at 10:15. No armored vest tonight. He thinks he's safe with me. Do not miss." The recording ended with a soft, chilling click. It was Choi Hana. The woman Minyi was supposed to marry had not just facilitated a hit, she had orchestrated it with the surgical precision of a seasoned betrayer. Minyi didn't move. He didn't rage or overturn the table. Instead, he became even more still, a terrifying silence blooming around him that made the guards at the door shift uncomfortably. He stared at the phone, his reflection visible in the dark glass next to the data that proved his life was a lie. The woman he had chosen as his partner, the one who was meant to bridge his underworld empire to the legitimate world of shipping and finance, had seen him as nothing more than a stepping stone. Or perhaps a hurdle to be removed. The betrayal was absolute. It wasn't just about the assassination attempt. It was the realization that his perfect, controlled life had been a theater, and he was the only one who hadn't known he was playing a part in his own tragedy. He felt the weight of the Korean flag pin on his lapel, a symbol of the power he thought he held, and it felt like a leaden brand. "She changed the plan because of the rain," Evelyn added softly, her eyes fixed on the floor to avoid seeing the look of raw, suppressed devastation on his face. "The original sniper perch was washed out by the fog. That's why the text came through when it did. She was updating them in real time." She looked up then, her fear momentarily eclipsed by a strange sense of pity for the man who had everything and nothing all at once. "She was standing right next to you, Mr. Park. She was smiling at you while she was telling them exactly where to aim." Minyi's hand slowly reached out, his fingers hovering over the phone before finally picking it up. He gripped it so hard the plastic casing creaked, but he didn't break it. He needed this evidence. It was the only weapon he had left in a city that had turned against him overnight. The realization settled over the warehouse like a thick, suffocating fog. The perfect life Minyi had built was a hollow shell, and the only reason he was alive to witness its collapse was because a girl from the world he ignored had been smart enough to see the truth. He turned his gaze away from the phone and looked at Evelyn, truly looked at her. He saw the bruises, the exhaustion, and the quiet, stubborn courage of someone who had nothing to gain and everything to lose by helping him. In the cold, calculating logic of the Mafia, she was a liability, a witness who knew his shame. But in the primal, instinctual logic of survival, she was the only thing standing between him and total erasure. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a gold lighter, flicking it open with a sharp, metallic clink. "The city thinks I'm dead, or at least dying," Minyi said, his voice now a low, dangerous rasp that sent shivers down Evelyn's spine. Hannah will be moving to consolidate the assets before the sun rises. She thinks she has won. He leaned over the table, his shadow looming over Evelyn like a dark wing. He didn't thank her. Gratitude was a language he had forgotten how to speak. Instead, he offered her something much more valuable in his world, a purpose. You've shown me the evidence, delivery girl. Now you're going to help me burn the house down around her. You know the routes they don't monitor. You know how to move through this city without being seen. He straightened up, the lethal boss returning, but with a new, singular focus. If you stay with me, you might die, but if you leave this warehouse now, they will find you before you reach your apartment. Choose. The warehouse doors groaned open, and the backup SUV tore out into the night, its headlights cutting through the heavy mist like twin blades. Park Min-yi sat in the back, his jaw set in a line of granite, while Evelyn gripped the leather seat, her knuckles white. They weren't alone. As they cleared the shipyard perimeter, 3 sets of headlights flickered to life in the rearview mirror, heavy, modified sedans that moved with a predatory coordination. The syndicate wasn't waiting for the morning to confirm the kill. They were cleaning up the loose ends. The city of snipers had transformed from a metaphor into a literal gauntlet. Every rooftop was a potential perch, and every intersection was a kill zone. Min-yi's driver swerved hard, tires screaming as he dove into the narrow, neon-lit arteries of the city, but the pursuers clung to them like shadows. The hunters had the advantage of numbers, technology, and a city that had been prepared for Min-yi's downfall for weeks. The first shot shattered the SUV's side mirror, a high-velocity round that hummed past the window with a terrifying metallic whine. "Get down," Min-yi barked, shoving Evelyn toward the floorboards. He didn't wait for his guards to act. He reached into the seat pocket, pulled out a submachine gun, and rolled down the window. The freezing air rushed in, smelling of rain and burnt rubber. Min-yi returned fire with a clinical, terrifying rhythm, the muzzle flashes illuminating his face in strobe-like bursts of orange light. He wasn't a man panicking. He was a man in his element, a warlord fighting for a kingdom he had already lost. But as they rounded a corner into the heart of the garment district, a second SUV slammed into their rear bumper, the impact jarring Evelyn's teeth. They were being funneled. The syndicate was driving them toward the wider boulevards, where the snipers had clear lines of sight. "They're pushing us toward the Mapo Bridge," the driver shouted, his hands wrestling with the steering wheel as the car fishtailed on the slick asphalt. "If we hit the open road, we're dead." Min-yi looked at the map on the dashboard, his eyes scanning the grid of the city. He knew the main roads, the luxury routes, and the secure checkpoints, but the syndicate knew them too. They had hacked the traffic cameras and blocked the escapes. He looked down at Evelyn, who was curled in a ball, her eyes wide with a strange, frantic clarity. She wasn't just terrified, she was calculating. She had spent 5 years memorizing every alleyway, every loading dock, and every shortcut that didn't appear on a standard GPS. She knew the city's hidden veins, the paths used by those who were too poor to afford the main roads or too hurried to follow the law. "Turn left at the next alley," Evelyn cried out, her voice barely audible over the roar of the wind and the crackle of gunfire. "It looks blocked, but the bollards are loose. There's a passage through the old textile market that leads to the subterranean canal." Min-yi didn't hesitate. He saw the doubt in his driver's eyes, but he felt the conviction in the girl's scream. "Do what she says," he commanded, his voice cutting through the chaos like a blade. The driver yanked the wheel, and the heavy SUV tilted on 2 wheels before slamming back down and plunging into a narrow gap between 2 crumbling brick buildings. The pursuers tried to follow, but their wider, heavier cars struggled with the tight geometry of the old city. One of the syndicate sedans clipped a dumpster, spinning out into a shower of sparks and trash, but the other 2 remained, their engines roaring in a blind fury. The chase became a blur of hanging laundry, narrow stone arches, and the blinding glare of flickering shop signs. Evelyn guided them with a feverish intensity, her hands gesturing toward hidden cut-throughs and pedestrian walkways that the SUV barely cleared by inches. The side view mirrors were sheared off by the brickwork, and the paint was stripped from the doors as they scraped through the ghost roots. Behind them, the pursuers were relentless, their bullets thudding into the armored plating of the SUV's rear. They reached a dead end, a massive steel gate that guarded a private freight elevator. "The code is 0422, Evelyn yelled, remembering a delivery she'd made to a black market chef months ago. The driver punched the numbers, and the gate groaned open just as a sniper's bullet sparked off the roof of the car. They slid inside, the elevator plunging them into the darkness of the city's underbelly. For a moment the sound of the world vanished, replaced by the heavy, echoing hum of the elevator cables. In the sudden dimness, the only light came from the glowing dashboard and the embers of Minyi's anger. He looked at Evelyn, his chest heaving, a smear of soot across his high cheekbone. She was shaking, her breath hitching in her throat, but she had saved him for the second time in a single hour. He realized then that his power, his wealth, and his army had been useless in the face of a coordinated betrayal. It was the girl's map of the invisible world that had kept them breathing. The city of snipers was still waiting for them above, but for now, they were in the deep dark where the syndicate's eyes couldn't reach. He reached out and touched her shoulder, a gesture that was almost human. The elevator hit the basement level with a jarring thud, and the doors opened to a sprawling network of maintenance tunnels that ran beneath the Han River. It was cold, damp, and smelled of ancient concrete. "They'll find the entrance eventually," Minyi said, his voice returning to its low, authoritative rasp. He checked his weapon, the cold metal clicking in the silence. He wasn't just a target anymore. He was a hunter who had found a hidden path. He looked at the long, dark tunnel ahead, then at the girl who had guided him there. The high-speed chase had stripped away the last of his illusions. He knew now that the only way to survive the night was to stop running and start dismantling the people who thought they had won. He signaled for the driver to extinguish the lights. They moved forward in the total blackness, the SUV creeping through the water-slicked tunnels like a ghost. Evelyn sat back against the seat, her heart finally slowing to a dull, aching throb. She had helped him navigate the city of snipers, but she knew the hardest part was yet to come. They were no longer just escaping a hit. They were heading toward a confrontation that would determine who owned the soul of Seoul. Minyi leaned forward, his eyes fixed on the darkness ahead, his mind already weaving a plan of cold, surgical retribution. The chase had ended, but the war had just begun. He whispered a name under his breath, Hana, and the way he said it made Evelyn realize that the rain outside was nothing compared to the storm this man was about to unleash on his own home. The subterranean tunnels beneath the Han River were a labyrinth of shadow and damp concrete, a world forgotten by the glittering skyline above. In the claustrophobic silence of the SUV, the only sound was the rhythmic drip of water and the heavy breathing of four people who had just stared into the abyss of their own deaths. Park Minyi sat in the rear, a statue carved from granite in suppressed fury, his eyes fixed on the back of Evelyn's head. She was leaning forward between the front seats, her fingers tracing invisible lines in the air as if she were reading a map etched into the very darkness. The ghost routes were not just shortcuts, they were the secret veins of Seoul, the narrow arteries used by the invisible labor force to bypass the gridlock and surveillance of the surface. To Minyi, these paths were beneath notice, but tonight they were the only reason his heart was still beating. He watched the girl, marveling at the strange, frantic intelligence that allowed her to navigate this lightless maze with the certainty of a priestess. "Kill the engine," Evelyn whispered, her voice echoing strangely against the curved tunnel walls. The driver hesitated, glancing at Minyi for approval. With a sharp, nearly imperceptible nod from the boss, the SUV went silent, the humming dashboard lights plunging the interior into a deep, bruised purple. "We wait here. 5 minutes. There's a ventilation shaft 300 meters back. If they're following us, their headlights will sweep the upper rafters before they hit the ground level. We need to know if they have infrared." Minyi didn't argue. He leaned back, his hand resting on the cold grip of his submachine gun, his senses heightened to a degree he hadn't felt since his early days on the docks. He realized that in this environment his wealth and title were useless. Here, Evelyn Hart was the one holding the scepter. She understood the acoustics of the tunnels, the timing of the automated drainage pumps, and the exact angle of the shadows. She was no longer just a delivery girl. She was their navigator through the underworld. The minutes stretched like wire, taut and humming with tension. Suddenly, a faint, flickering light brushed the ceiling of the tunnel far behind them. The hunters were there. They moved with a clinical predatory slowness, their engines muffled but their intent radiating through the dark. Evelyn didn't panic. She watched the light as it swept across the rusted pipes, her eyes tracking its movement with a terrifying focus. "They're using standard optics," she breathed, a small, grim smile touching her lips. "They don't realize the tunnels are tiered. Follow the incline to the left but keep the lights off. There's an old maintenance ramp that was built for the 1988 construction. It's too narrow for their sedans, but this SUV has a reinforced axle. We can climb it." The driver shifted into low gear, the vehicle groaning as it began a blind ascent into a secondary tunnel that smelled of stagnant water and ancient dust. The ghost routes were a gauntlet of physical obstacles. They scraped past heavy iron gates that Evelyn forced open with a rusted crowbar she found in a tool locker, and they navigated narrow bridges that felt as though they might collapse under the weight of the armored car. At one point, they had to drive through a flooded section where the water rose to the base of the doors, the surface reflecting the flickering emergency lights like a dark, oil-slicked mirror. Minyi watched Evelyn throughout it all. He saw the way she didn't flinch when a pipe burst nearby, or when the sound of the pursuer's engines echoed from a parallel shaft. She was a ghost of the city, a girl who had survived by knowing exactly where the shadows were deepest. He saw her competence, her grit, and a strange, flickering loyalty that he couldn't quite rationalize. She wasn't doing this for money. She hadn't even asked for any. She was doing it because she had seen a man being hunted, and she had chosen to be the one who broke the cycle of betrayal. "We're coming up behind the fish market in Noryangin," Evelyn announced as the incline leveled off. "There's a freight lift that opens directly into the refrigeration units. The syndicate won't be watching it because the biometric scanners are supposed to be offline. But the night shift manager owes me a favor for a delivery I made in the middle of a typhoon last year. He leaves the manual override unlocked on Tuesdays." She looked back at Minyi, her face pale and streaked with soot, but her eyes were burning with a fierce, defiant light. "Once we're in the market, we can swap vehicles. They'll be looking for the SUV. They won't be looking for a beat-up refrigerated van that smells like mackerel." Minyi looked at her, and for the first time the corner of his mouth twitched in something that resembled a smile. It was a cold, dangerous expression, but it held a glimmer of genuine respect. "You have a remarkable memory for favors, Evelyn Hart," he said, his voice a low, melodic rasp. They hit the surface just as the first hint of gray light began to bleed into the eastern sky. The transition from the dark tunnels to the frantic, smelling chaos of the early morning fish market was jarring. The air was thick with the scent of sea salt, ice, and blood. Amidst the shouting vendors and the clatter of plastic crates, the SUV was just another vehicle in the morning rush. Evelyn led them to a rusted white van parked in a loading bay, its engine already idling. As they moved Minyi's weapons and the encrypted phone into the new vehicle, the pursuer's sedans roared past the main entrance of the market, their drivers focused on the arterial roads, completely unaware that their prey was sitting 10 feet away behind a stack of crab traps. The ghost routes had worked. They had slipped through the net of the most sophisticated hunting party in Seoul, using nothing but a delivery girl's map of the forgotten city. Minyi sat on a wooden crate inside the van, the smell of fish a sharp contrast to the expensive cologne that usually defined his space. He looked at his hands, which were stained with grease and oil, and then at Evelyn, who was slumped against the metal wall, her eyes finally closing in a moment of sheer exhaustion. They were safe for the moment, but the city was still a battlefield. He realized that the woman he had intended to marry was likely at this very moment sitting in his office, drinking his coffee and directing the men who were trying to kill him. The thought brought a cold, clarifying clarity to his mind. He wasn't just a boss anymore. He was a ghost, and thanks to the girl beside him, he was a ghost who knew every secret door in the castle. The hitters had lost the trail, but Minyi had found a new one. The van lurched forward, pulling out into the morning traffic of Seoul. They were no longer the hunted. As the sun began to catch the glass of the skyscrapers, Minyi reached over and picked up the cracked smartphone from the floor. He didn't look at the messages this time. He looked at the reflection of the girl in the dark screen. She had given him the ghost routes, the hidden paths to survival. Now, it was time for him to show the city how a ghost takes his revenge. He leaned toward the driver and gave a new set of coordinates, not to a safe house, but to the private residence of his fiancée's father. The night was over and the day of reckoning had arrived. "Evelyn," he said softly, and she opened her eyes. "Don't fall asleep yet. We still have one more delivery to make." The refrigerated van vibrated with a low, rhythmic hum as it pulled into the underground parking structure of a discreet, high-rise safe house in the Gangnam district. This was a place not listed in the official Mafia registry, a sanctuary designed for a ghost. Park Min-yi stepped out of the back, the smell of mackerel and salt still clinging to his ruined charcoal suit, but his posture had returned to its terrifying, absolute rigidity. He didn't look like a man who had spent the night hiding in tunnels. He looked like a reaper who had come to collect a long-overdue debt. Evelyn followed him, her steps heavy with a mixture of exhaustion and a strange, cold dread. She had guided him through the city's veins, but now they were entering the heart of the betrayal. The air in the concrete garage was still and chilled, the silence broken only by the soft click of Min-yi's boots as he approached the private elevator. He adjusted the Korean flag pin on his lapel with a steady hand, his face a mask of frozen, lethal intent. When the elevator doors slid open into the penthouse foyer, the atmosphere changed instantly. The scent of expensive lilies and vanilla-scented candles filled the air, a sickeningly sweet contrast to the gunpowder and exhaust of the last few hours. Standing by the floor-to-ceiling windows, framed by the gray morning light of the Seoul skyline, was Choi Hana. She was dressed in a silk robe, a glass of vintage champagne in her hand, her expression one of serene, practiced victory. She was already holding Min-yi's primary tablet, likely middle-deep in the process of rerouting the syndicate's offshore accounts. She didn't hear them at first. She was humming a soft, melodic tune, the sound of a woman who had finally stepped out from the shadow of a powerful man. Then Min-yi spoke, his voice a low, vibrating rasp that seemed to turn the very air to ice. "The vintage is a bit early for a funeral, don't you think, Hana?" The glass shattered against the marble floor. Hana spun around, her face instantly drained of color, her eyes widening into orbs of pure, unadulterated terror. For a heartbeat, she looked as though she were seeing a literal ghost. Her gaze darted from Min-yi's blood-streaked face to Evelyn, who stood just behind him like a silent witness from a world Hana had spent her life ignoring. The silence that followed was suffocating, a vacuum where the perfect life they had shared was incinerated in a single moment of recognition. Hana's hand flew to her throat, her breath coming in shallow, frantic gasps. "Min-yi, you're—" "The report said the car was incinerated," she stammered, her voice losing its refined edge and turning into something thin and desperate. She tried to take a step forward, a fake mask of relief beginning to form on her features, but the look in Min-yi's eyes stopped her dead in her tracks. "The reports were written by the men you hired," Min-yi said, taking a slow, deliberate step toward her. He didn't raise his voice, but the authority in his tone was a physical force that seemed to shrink the room. "The men who are currently lying in a gutter in District 7. You were so focused on the exit strategy that you forgot one fundamental rule of this city, Hana. You forgot about the people you don't see." He gestured toward Evelyn, whose navy blue delivery cap was pulled low, her eyes fixed on the woman who had sold a man's life for a shipping empire. "This girl intercepted your kill order. She saw the red dot you placed on my heart while you were smiling at me across a dinner table. She is the glitch in your perfect plan." Hana looked at Evelyn then, her expression shifting from fear to a sudden, ugly sneer of elitist contempt. To Hannah, Evelyn was nothing but a peasant, a biological error that had ruined a masterpiece of corporate espionage. "You risked everything for this," Hannah spat, her voice trembling with a mixture of rage and panic as she looked back at Minyi. "For a nobody on a scooter, you think this changes anything? The syndicate has already moved. My father has the signatures. You're a dead man walking, Minyi. If you kill me, you'll never see the sun rise." Minyi didn't blink. He reached out and snatched the tablet from her hand, his eyes scanning the transaction logs. He saw the betrayal in its digital form, the transfer of assets, the liquidation of his loyalists' pensions, the total erasure of his legacy. It was a cold, clinical theft. He looked at the woman he was supposed to marry, seeing her clearly for the first time. She wasn't a partner. She was a parasite who had grown fat on his protection. The realization didn't bring him pain. It brought him a sharp, clarifying sense of purpose. "I'm not going to kill you, Hannah," Minyi said, his voice dropping to a whisper that made Evelyn's blood run cold. He leaned in close, his shadow engulfing his fiancée until she looked small and fragile against the glass. "Death is too quick for a betrayal of this magnitude. I'm going to let you live to see exactly what happens to a kingdom built on sand." He tapped a command on the tablet, a sequence of codes he had kept hidden even from his closest advisors. Across the room, a secondary monitor flared to life, showing the live feeds of her father's shipping offices. Teams of masked men, his true loyalists who had been waiting for his signal, were already moving in. "I've frozen the accounts. The signatures you stole are now linked to a federal money laundering investigation. By the time you leave this building, you will have nothing. No name, no family, and no place to hide." Hannah collapsed onto the sofa, her silk robe fluttering like the wings of a dying moth. She looked at the screen, then at Minyi, the reality of her total defeat finally sinking in. She had played the game of shadows and lost to the man who truly owned them. Evelyn watched the confrontation with a heavy heart, seeing the wreckage of two lives that had been built on lies. She realized that while she had saved Minyi's body, his world was gone. He was no longer the untouchable boss. He was a man who had to burn his own house down to stay alive. The face of betrayal was beautiful and refined, but beneath the silk and the champagne, it was hollow. Minyi turned away from his former fiancée, his eyes finding Evelyn. The lethal rage was still there, but beneath it was a flicker of something else, a recognition that the delivery girl was the only real thing left in his life. "We're leaving," Minyi said, grabbing a secure briefcase from a hidden wall safe. He didn't look back at Hannah, who was now sobbing silently into her hands. He walked toward the elevator, his pace steady and relentless. Evelyn followed him out, the scent of vanilla and lilies fading as the metal doors closed on the ruins of his perfect life. As they descended toward the garage, the silence was different than before. It was no longer the silence of the hunted, but the silence of a man preparing for a final tactical strike. Minyi looked at his reflection in the mirrored walls of the elevator, then at the girl in the navy blue jacket. "The safe house is no longer safe," he said, his voice regaining its metallic edge. "But I know a place they won't look, somewhere dark, somewhere only a ghost can find." He reached out and pressed the button for the basement, his mind already moving to the next move. The safe house was a compromise now, a glass lantern in a city full of moths, and Park Minyi knew the hunters were closing the circle. They didn't return to the streets. Instead, they descended deeper into the building's skeletal infrastructure, moving through the service tunnels that fed the district's power grid. The air here was dry and hummed with the electric thrum of high-voltage transformers, a vibrating heat that seemed to mirror the tension coiling in Minyi's chest. Evelyn led the way, her small flashlight cutting a narrow path through the gloom. She knew this subterranean world better than any architect. She had spent years navigating these basements to find the service elevators that bypassed the high-security lobbies of her wealthier clients. Behind them, the distant, rhythmic thud of heavy boots echoed through the ventilation shafts. The syndicate's cleanup crew had arrived, and they weren't interested in a conversation. They were coming to snuff out the last witness to their failure. "They're using thermal imaging," Minyi whispered, his voice a low vibration in the dark. He checked the magazine of his sidearm, the cold metal clicking with a finality that made Evelyn's breath hitch. In this heat, the transformers will mask our signatures for a few minutes, but once they reach the junction, they'll pin us down. He looked at the heavy steel doors ahead, then at the girl whose face was illuminated by the backwash of her light. She looked exhausted, her eyes rimmed with red, but there was a sharp, frantic intelligence still working behind them. She wasn't a soldier, but she understood the geometry of the dark. She looked at the massive breaker panels lining the wall, her mind jumping through the blueprints she'd memorized during late-night deliveries to the building's maintenance staff. She knew that in a fair fight, Minyi and his 2 remaining guards would be overwhelmed by the syndicate's superior numbers. They needed to change the rules of the engagement. "I can drop the entire district's grid from here," Evelyn said, her voice trembling but certain. She pointed to a series of oversized lever switches protected by a locked cage. "It's a cascading blackout. If I pull the primary and the secondary surge protectors, the backup generators will take 30 seconds to kick in. In this building, the emergency lights are on a separate circuit, but the basement sensors are slave to the main hub. If I kill the power, the thermal imaging will bloom. It'll be like a flashbang to their goggles." Minyi's eyes narrowed, his mind instantly calculating the tactical advantage. In total darkness, the hunters would be blind, relying on technology that she was about to sabotage. He, however, had spent a lifetime navigating the shadows of the soul. He nodded, a grim, appreciative shadow of a smile touching his lips. "Do it. When the lights go out, stay behind the transformer housing. Don't move until I come for you." Evelyn didn't hesitate. She grabbed a heavy iron wrench from a nearby tool rack and smashed the padlock on the breaker cage with a violent, desperate strength. She gripped the primary lever, the cold steel biting into her palm, and pulled. The world didn't just go dark, it died. The hum of the transformers vanished, replaced by a silence so profound it felt like a physical weight. High above, the skyline of Gangnam flickered and vanished, plunging the street-level world into chaos, but down here, the darkness was absolute. A second later, the shouting began. The hunters, caught in the sudden surge of the blackout, were blinded by their own high-tech gear, their night vision goggles overloaded by the sudden thermal spike of the dying breakers. Minyi moved like a ghost. He didn't need light to find his enemies. He followed the sound of their panicked breathing and the clumsy clatter of their tactical gear against the metal railings. The fight was a series of muffled impacts and sudden, violent bursts of suppressed gunfire. Evelyn huddled behind the massive cooling fins of the transformer, her hands over her ears, her heart hammering against her ribs. She couldn't see anything, but she could feel the air shift as bodies moved through the space. She heard a man grunt in pain, the sound of a heavy body hitting the concrete, and the clinical, terrifying efficiency of Minyi's movements. He was a predator who had spent his life preparing for a moment where the world was as dark as his own heart. The hunters, trained for high-end corporate hits, were lost in the gutter-level reality of a total blackout. They were fighting a man who had nothing left to lose and a girl who knew every inch of the labyrinth. One by one, the sounds of the syndicate's crew faded, replaced by the heavy, rhythmic thud of Minyi's boots returning to her position. The emergency lights finally flickered to life, casting a dim, sickly red glow over the service tunnel. The scene was one of cold, surgical devastation. 4 of the syndicate's elite hitters were down, neutralized by a man who had used the darkness as a weapon. Minyi stood in the center of the room, his chest heaving slightly, a smear of blood across his forehead that wasn't his own. He looked at Evelyn, and for the first time, the lethal mask of the Mafia boss didn't just show authority. It showed a raw, shimmering respect. She had provided the window he needed to dismantle his enemies. Her unimportant knowledge of the city's wiring and maintenance schedules had proven more effective than a dozen bodyguards. They were standing in the ruins of the power grid, surrounded by the wreckage of a failed hit, and Minyi realized that the delivery girl was the only person who had actually fought beside him. "We need to move," Minyi said, his voice a low rasp that cut through the dying echoes of the fight. He reached down and picked up a dropped tactical radio, listening to the frantic chatter of the syndicate's command center. They were confused, panicked, and starting to realize that the ghost of Park Min-yi was still haunting the city. He turned to Evelyn, his gaze lingering on her for a heartbeat longer than necessary. The blackout had ended, but the tactical shift was permanent. He wasn't just a boss anymore, and she wasn't just a rider. They were a team of two, carved out of the night and the rain. He signaled toward the service exit that led to the subterranean canal. The city is dark and the hunters are blind. Now we go to the one place Hana thinks is already hers. We're going to the headquarters. Evelyn stood up, her legs shaking but her resolve holding firm. She looked at the red-lit tunnel, then at the man who had become her unlikely shadow. She had saved him again, not with a gun, but with the skills of a ghost. The tactical fight in the dark was over. But the final outcome was still unwritten. As they stepped into the damp, cold air of the canal passage, she realized that she was no longer afraid of the shadows. She had learned to control them. Min-yi led the way, his hand resting briefly on the small of her back, a gesture of protection that felt like a silent oath. They were moving toward the heart of the empire, and this time they weren't going to hide. They were going to finish what the delivery text had started. The glass and steel monolith of the Min-yi Group headquarters loomed over Seoul like a silent sentinel. But inside, the air was thick with the scent of ozone and the cold sweat of a crumbling regime. Park Min-yi entered the lobby not as a victim, but as a force of nature. He moved through the high-security gates with a terrifying, absolute silence, his presence alone causing the turnstiles to unlock and the security guards to freeze in mid-motion. He did not need to fire a single shot. The mere sight of him, blood-stained and wearing the ruins of a $1,000 suit, was enough to break the will of men who had been told he was a corpse. Behind him, Evelyn Hart walked with her head held high, the navy blue cap a stark contrast to the marble and gold. She was the witness, the living proof of the betrayal that had nearly cost a king his throne. Together, they ascended to the top floor, the elevator rising with a clinical hum that felt like the sharpening of a blade. The boardroom was a theater of treachery. Choi Hana was seated at the head of the table, surrounded by the board members who had already signed their souls over to her father's shipping conglomerate. They were in the middle of a celebratory toast when the heavy oak doors burst open. The clink of crystal stopped instantly as Min-yi stepped into the light. He didn't scream. He didn't even look at the board members. His gaze was fixed solely on Hana, whose face transformed from a mask of triumph into a silent scream of pure, existential horror. Min-yi placed the cracked smartphone on the center of the table, the screen still glowing with the evidence of her kill order. "The dead is called," he said, his voice a low, vibrating rasp that seemed to vibrate the very glass of the skyscraper. "And tonight, I am the only one who collects." The cleaning of the house was surgical. Within minutes, the loyalists who had been waiting for Min-yi's signal flooded the room, escorted by the federal investigators he had mobilized during the ride over. Hana and her father were led away in handcuffs, their empire of lies collapsing under the weight of the digital trail Evelyn had uncovered. But for Min-yi, the business of revenge was secondary to the settlement of the life debt. He stood at the massive window, looking out over the neon grid of the city he had nearly lost, and then he turned to the girl who had saved him. Evelyn was standing by the door, her shoulders slumped with a fatigue that went deeper than bone. She looked small in that cavernous room, a ghost of the working class who had accidentally dismantled a mafia syndicate. She expected a thank you, perhaps a ride home, and then to return to the life of an invisible rider. Min-yi approached her, his footsteps heavy and deliberate. He stopped inches from her, his shadow engulfing her, but the lethal chill that usually defined him had been replaced by a strange, shimmering intensity. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a small, obsidian-black card with an embossed gold phoenix, the symbol of his private, personal accounts. He didn't offer it. He placed it firmly into her palm, his fingers closing around hers for a heartbeat. "This is not a reward," he said, his voice dropping to a whisper that only she could hear. "This is a key. You are no longer a ghost, Evelyn Hart. From this moment on, your name is protected. Your debts are erased and your future is written in the same ink as mine. If you ever find yourself in the dark again, you do not need to hide. You only need to call." Evelyn looked down at the card, the weight of it feeling like a mountain. She realized then that her life as a delivery girl had ended the moment she had swerved her scooter to save a stranger. She was no longer a girl delivering noodles for $10 an hour. She was the only person in the world who had the ear of the man who owned the shadows. She looked up at Minyi, seeing the raw, honest respect in his dark eyes. He was still a dangerous man, a man of blood and iron, but he was also a man who had been taught the value of the invisible by the very person he would have ignored a day ago. The debt was settled, but the bond that had been forged in the rain and the fire of District 7 was something that went beyond the logic of the underworld. It was a bridge between two worlds that should never have met. He signaled to his primary bodyguard, a man who had been with him since the docks, "Take her to the estate, secure a permanent residence in her name, and make sure the scooter is replaced with something that doesn't rattle." A small, genuine ghost of a smile touched Evelyn's lips at the mention of her bike. She looked at the office, at the power that filled the room, and then at the open door. She was safe. For the first time in her life, she didn't have to look over her shoulder. She had walked into a war as a messenger and walked out as a guardian. Minyi watched her go, his posture regaining its kingly rigidity as he prepared to rebuild his empire from the ashes. He knew that the city would always have snipers and the shadows would always have vipers, but he also knew that he had a guardian angel who knew the ghost roots. As the elevator doors closed on Evelyn, she felt the silence of the building wrap around her like a shield. She touched the black card in her pocket, feeling the cold, smooth surface. She wasn't just a delivery girl anymore. She was a legend whispered in the baccalas and the service tunnels of Seoul. She had stood between the boss and the bullet, and in doing so, she had found her own power. The night was over, and the sun was finally beginning to rise over the Han River, bathing the city in a soft, golden light. The world looked the same, but for Evelyn Hart everything had changed. She walked out of the lobby and into the morning air, breathing in the scent of a city that finally knew her name. The debt was paid, the house was clean, and the future was hers to deliver. 6 months had passed since the night the sky over District 7 rained glass and betrayal. Yet the memory of the freezing wind still lingered in the corners of Evelyn Hart's mind. The city of Seoul looked much the same to the casual observer, a sprawling, neon-lit tapestry of ambition and anonymity. But beneath the surface, the gears of the underworld had been recalibrated by a girl on a scooter and a man who had survived his own funeral. Evelyn no longer wore the worn, navy blue jacket of a struggling rider. Today, she stepped out of a sleek, charcoal-gray SUV that moved through the traffic with the quiet authority of a predator. She wore a tailored suit of deep midnight blue, her movements fluid and confident, her eyes no longer searching for the fastest route to a $10 tip, but scanning the horizons for the subtle shifts in the city's power. She was the director of logistical intelligence for the Minyi Group, a title that was a polite euphemism for the woman who controlled the flow of information through the city's invisible veins. Park Min-yi stood at the edge of a private helipad overlooking the Han River, his hands clasped behind his back, his silhouette sharp against the setting sun. His empire had been rebuilt from the ashes of Hana's treachery, but it was no longer a fortress of isolated steel. It was a network, a living organism that breathed through the service tunnels, the freight elevators, and the delivery routes that Evelyn had taught him to respect. He didn't turn as she approached. He didn't need to. He recognized the steady, purposeful rhythm of her gait, a sound that had become the baseline of his new reality. The silence between them was no longer a vacuum of suspicion, but a shared sanctuary. They were the architects of a new order, a regime where the working class was no longer a ghost in the machine, but the eyes and ears of the man who held the scepter. Min-yi had learned that true power didn't come from being untouchable. It came from being connected to the people the world ignored. "The delivery is ready," Evelyn said, her voice steady and resonant in the open air. She held a small, wax-sealed envelope, its weight insignificant compared to the message it contained. This was her final delivery, a tradition they had established to mark the transition of their alliance from a desperate survival tactic into a permanent state of governance. It wasn't a pizza, and it wasn't a misinterpreted text meant for an assassin. It was a dossier of the remaining syndicate cells that had tried to fill the vacuum left by the Choi family. Within those pages were the names, locations, and bank accounts of every man who thought they could still operate in the shadows of Minyi's city without paying the toll of loyalty. Evelyn had spent the last month coordinating with the riders, the janitors, and the night shift technicians, the nobody army that now served as Minyi's most effective intelligence agency. Minyi finally turned, his dark eyes finding hers. The lethal mask was still there, a permanent fixture of a man who ruled by blood and iron, but when he looked at Evelyn, there was a flicker of something that resembled a profound, silent gratitude. He took the envelope from her hand, his fingers brushing hers with a familiarity that had been forged in the blackout and the rain. "The city thinks we are a myth," he said, his voice a low, melodic rasp that carried over the sound of the distant traffic. "They think the delivery girl was a ghost story used to frighten the vipers. They don't realize that the ghost has become the warden." He looked down at the dossier, then back at the skyline. He knew that the peace they had built was fragile, a balance of power maintained by the constant vigilance of a girl who knew every shortcut in the dark. But for the first time in his life, he didn't feel alone in his kingdom. Evelyn looked out over the river, the water reflecting the gold and violet of the dying light. She remembered the shaking hands and the cold noodles of her former life, and it felt like a dream she had had decades ago. She had walked into the crosshairs of a Mafia hit and walked out as the woman who held the keys to the city. She had proven that innocence wasn't a weakness, but a perspective that the powerful were too blinded by their own light to see. Her final delivery was more than just a message of power. It was a declaration of her own existence. She was Evelyn Hart, the girl who had intercepted a kill order and decided that the boss deserved to live. She had swerved her scooter into the path of destiny, and in doing so, she had redrawn the map of soul in her own image. The snipers were still watching, but now they were watching for her signal. "We have a meeting in District 7 tonight," Minyi said, pocketing the envelope and gesturing toward the waiting helicopter. "The new docks are being finished. I want you there to oversee the security protocols." Evelyn nodded, a small, knowing smile touching her lips. She knew exactly which ventilation shafts were vulnerable and which service stairs offered the best escape routes. She was the guardian of the new order, the bridge between the silk and the gutter. As they walked toward the aircraft together, the wind whipping at their coats, the symmetry of their alliance was absolute. The boss and the rider, the lion and the ghost. They had traded a perfect life for a real one, a world of shadows for a world of clarity. The delivery was made, the message was clear, and the city was finally quiet. As the helicopter rose into the evening sky, Evelyn looked down at the grid of lights below. She could see the tiny, flickering headlights of the delivery riders weaving through the traffic, 1,000 little pulses of life in the concrete jungle. She knew their struggles, their roots, and their secrets. And she knew that as long as she was standing beside the man who controlled the shadows, those riders would never be invisible again. The story that had begun with a buzzing phone in a wet pocket had reached its final chapter, but the legend was only just beginning. Park Min-yi looked at her one last time before the cabin dimmed, a silent acknowledgement of the debt that could never be fully settled. They were no longer the hunted. They were the ones who decided who got to stay in the light. The new order had arrived, and it was being delivered by the girl who knew the way through the dark.